Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Max Clark, and on behalf of the Fox Alliance and our whole team here, I am grateful that you have chosen to join us this afternoon as we seek to make sense of the AI revolution. We're going to be taking a little bit of a different approach to this presentation than we have with many of our other presentations in the past. And it's going to be a bit more of like a fireside chat sort of approach, a little bit more of a conversation between the three of us. As many of you guys know, my name is Max Clark, and I'm one of the wealth advisors here in the San Antonio office. But joining me today is Laura Cooper, who is the wealth advisor in our East Coast office in North Carolina. And then we have Josh Renfro with us, one of our founding partners, who's located there in Austin. We will we will be having some time for questions here at the end of our conversation. So if you do have a question, please feel free to send that to my email address, which is there on the screen, max@thefoxalliance.com. And we look forward to answering as many as we can before our time runs out today. As we kick things off, one of the reasons that we decided to have this conversation today is because AI has really taken off in really just the last couple of years. It's surprising me for me to realize that ChatGPT, which was really kind of the uh, impetus for everything that we've seen here, or the explosion onto into the public eye, really came on the scene at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. So we're just hitting that 3 year mark of when all of this came about. And now we're hearing talk and seeing things. For those of you that live in Austin, you're probably seeing Waymos all around, which are the, automated taxis or robo taxis. And we're also hearing Elon Musk talk about this, his desire to send a uh, fleet or army of AI robots to um, to Mars, to found Mars, or to settle Mars. And so there's a lot going on. But I think when a lot of us think about AI, what we often think of is just kind of this big black box that we might not know a lot about. And our desire today is to peel back the onion a little bit, peel back the curtain, and get a feel for what is really going on there. And hopefully, you guys come away having learned a little bit more about what AI is, where it's headed, and some of the headwinds and opportunities that we see going forward. So, as we kick things off, what the kind of the first question that I'd like us to discuss, and I'll direct this to you first, Laura, which is, what is it about today that has allowed AI to come onto the scene and to really explode? Why is today AI's time?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's really important to note that we are kind of at this technology crossroads right now where we have the technology available to process a significant amount of data in the form of these graphic processing units or GPUs. And we have a significant amount of data to process in the form of the entire internet. And so, we've had data processing units for decades now in the form of central processing units or CPUs. This is like the brain, the computer chip of every uh, electronic device on Earth. And CPUs, they process data very linearly. So, you have an input and that leads to an output. X equals Y. Um, Whereas GPUs allow for a significant number of outputs based on one input. So X as the input can lead to A, B, C, D, E, F, and G as the output all at the same time. And so where CPUs are very linear, GPUs are more of like a spider web of opportunity. When you have that level of data processing power and you're able to cluster these GPUs together, then you create this brain trust that can just really process a lot of data. And that's really led to the creation of these large language models, as you mentioned, like ChatGPT, Grok, Gemini, you pick the one that you like the most. Um, and being able to train those language models by using the data available on the internet. If we tried to create a ChatGPT like model today using CPUs, it would not even be done training by the time that all of us were dead. It would take multiple human lifetimes to train that model. And then what? It has to be constantly learning. So we're really at this point where we have these GPUs that have unlocked a real opportunity for us from an AI perspective.
Just a little more context on that. So GPUs really found their infancy first with gaming. So of all things, computer games, video games, that's where it really got its birth because in order to process all of the really high quality video that was integrated into these video games, you needed something more than what a CPU could ultimately end up handling. And so that ended up being, one of the areas that NVIDIA and AMD and others really did well in. Um, in about 2013, though, you would have these competitions to see which computing systems would process data and compete against these benchmarks. And in 2000, I think it was 13, there was a competition where one of the competitors used a um, a processing unit that was powered by just two NVIDIA GPUs, and it crushed everybody else. And of course, guess what? Everybody paid attention to that. All the hyperscalers, the Googles, the Microsofts of the world, they all began to notice, and that really started the process of learning. We talk about AI, taking off here in the last 3 years. The reality is that's something that's been in the works for a lot longer in that process. I think one other thing that is important just to think about is, just kind of thinking about the difference between the CPUs versus the GPUs. Imagine that a CPU is a gourmet chef. That gourmet chef, when they go in the kitchen, they can make one meal and they can make it really, really well. Maybe one dish really well, maybe two at a time. A GPU is the equivalent of having 1,000 line kitchen staff members all at once. They can cut 10,000 onions. They can peel 10,000 apples. They don't have to just do one thing all at once. And it was that fact, and then ultimately that being clustered or put together with other GPUs, which allows that effort to be magnified even further. That is what truly unlocks the exponential power that we've seen really start to unfold over the last, 4 to 5 years in a big way.
Yeah, so you're really taking this concept of going from one input, one output to now going from potentially thousands of inputs to thousands of different outputs, and you're able to do it all at one time. And then you can take those and combine them in the form of clusters. And it was interesting. I know Elon Musk recently had a breakthrough within the last year of being able to combine 100,000 or link together 100,000 of these GPUs. And he's talked about being able to get it to the point where it's a million GPUs linked together. So we're able to process potentially millions of inputs at once and have millions of outputs very quickly. Now, this ties into something else that I think is important for all of us to understand, which is the concept of training. Laura mentioned earlier that we got the prevalence of data on the internet that makes the ability to train these GPUs or these AIs more effectively. Josh, talk to us a little bit about what training is and even the term inference.
Yeah, so there's a few terms you may have heard in artificial intelligence thrown around: training, inference, reinforcement learning, and you probably have no clue, like me, when I first heard them, what on earth they are. So first off, so what is training? Think about training like the context of a student. If a student goes into a class, they have a textbook. Training is the equivalent of the student reading the textbook. So it's actually reading through all the information and kind of logging it in our brain, assuming that we had, the ability to perfectly recall all of those things. So that's the first layer of training. So within the context of AI, training looks like the GPUs being sent out to crawl the internet. And if you're not familiar with that term, that basically means visit every single site and analyze every single piece of data that exists on the internet today. You may have seen recently headlines about different companies suing OpenAI or others for not getting permission to use their data in training their models, as an example. That's what they mean. They are literally crawling and taking all that information and storing it and then learning that information. So that's what training is. Inference is where, assuming that that same student then is asked a question about the textbook, they take what they've learned and then they answer that question. And that was what was the big breakthrough with AI, was that specifically that piece is the ability to look at everything that you're trained on and then ultimately be able to answer the question. Now, we all probably remember back in the early days of ChatGPT and other large language models that the answers weren't always the most accurate. I distinctly remember kind of the scandal that happened with Google's Gemini when people asked them about George Washington and a picture of an African American man showed up on the screen. So, that'd be one example, but there were thousands of examples of situations where questions were asked and I was like, no, that's actually not accurate. And that's where this third concept within AI comes out, which is really important, which is this concept of reinforcement learning. You, through inference, ask questions, the GPUs seek to answer that question, and then they get feedback. Okay, actually, that was right. No, that was wrong. And over the course of time of doing that over and over and over again, guess what? It fine tunes its answers, and it gets more and more and more accurate. Which is why, as we've seen, each iteration of any of these models, from OpenAI ultimately to Llama, we have seen that these models have become better and better because ultimately they are getting additional reinforcement learning along with better GPUs and other things that ultimately reinforce that process.
Which also helps to allow to decrease bias, right, Josh? I mean, that's one of the
Well,
biggest.
it depends on what people want
Could
in the
be good,
process.
could be bad. Yeah.
Fair enough, fair enough.
If assuming that the reinforcement learning's desire is to bend towards basically a absolute truth, basically, then yes,
Fact.
it
Yeah.
has the ability to
Right.
keep it more factual and not and let it get bent one way or the other.
Yeah, so the big breakthrough is essentially we've gone from a decision tree, which is kind of the old CPU, right? If this happens, then this. If this happens, then this, to effectively functioning more like a human, right? Where we take everything that we've learned in the past and we come to a new situation where that we've never seen before. And because of everything that we've learned in the past, we're able to infer what the right answer might be or the right thing to do in this case would be. And that's really what has made things like autonomous driving possible, right? They're able to analyze millions, potentially billions of pieces of data from past driving experiences and know, hey, that's a stop sign. I should stop here. I shouldn't run into the tree. Those types of things. And it's obviously a lot more fast paced and complicated than that. But that's ultimately what inference has ultimately led to. So this kind of ties into the next point that we want to talk about, which is we've heard a lot in the past and recently too about this concept of AGI, artificial general intelligence, and when we achieve AGI, some pretty amazing things are going to happen. And when we think about this, think of kind of a progression of AI going forward. It kind of begins with artificial narrow intelligence, which is you've got an AI that is designed to perform specific tasks. I think many people would agree, is this concept that the the AI can behave in a human-like way and at a human-like level across all tasks, where basically the computer becomes indistinguishable from an individual or from a person. And then you've got this end objective of artificial superintelligence or ASI, where the AI is smarter than humans. It's what you ultimately see with kind of sci-fi movies, right? That would potentially be the end objective. We'll see. I want to talk a little bit about this, and Josh, maybe you can start us out, which is where are we in this spectrum, and when are we likely to potentially hit some of these milestones, and what would the significance of those be?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So first off, where do we come from? We came from artificial narrow intelligence, this concept we've alluded to several times of you give one input, a good example of this would be like you have the sensor at a door. Door opens and it dings to let people know that they're coming in. So that's what you effectively had in a lot of different areas across the economy is that kind of more linear type of computing. So artificial general intelligence, first off, not everybody agrees about what the definition is. So some people would define it as achieving human-like intelligence in a specific area. Some people would define it more broadly as being able to function in a human across all areas. So it is important just to recognize that. But if you were to look at the experts, the CEOs of the hyperscalers or of some of these large language model companies, you're going to get varying answers. So if you talk to someone like Sam Altman from OpenAI, you're going to find that he tends to believe that we're going to get there in the next year or two. And there's others that are in that same camp with him. You have others like the CEO of DeepSeek that ultimately believes that we're probably, I'm sorry, DeepMind, who ultimately believe that we're probably somewhere in the 2030 to 2033 kind of time frame. So there's varying time frames, but somewhere from several years to like 10 years is what most people believe is practical. So the question, of course, is why is it so significant? Why is it so significant for us to be able to get from narrow intelligence to artificial general intelligence? And I think probably the best way to think about this is in the context of an example. So let's think about something like disease research. Okay. So in the world today, there are only so many PhD capable researchers that can be dispatched to actually work on solving and trying to cure diseases. That's the limiting factor, is the number of people that ultimately can do that. Imagine, though, that we have the ability to create artificial general intelligence, and now the GPU can effectively act as another person that can do that research. One of the limiting factors of let's say that there's 50,000 humans that are actually able to do this kind of function. Guess what? They have to sleep. Third of their day is gone. They have to eat. They have to go to the restroom. They want weekends off and they want vacation. So guess what? There's a large chunk of their time each year that ultimately is not dedicated towards researching these particular things. When you get to the point that artificial intelligence can actually be another person in the trenches with them working towards that objective, that is a unit that does not have to sleep, that can go 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that doesn't need vacations or eating or needing to go to the restroom. And so that's the power, is ultimately you can not just one, but you can unlock tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even if you have enough computing power, enough money, enough energy, even potentially millions of additional brains looking to work and solve a problem collectively together. And that's what really makes AGI so significant is within business, there are three kinds of leverage that a business can ultimately unlock to make themselves better. You have human leverage, more people working on a problem. You can have technological leverage, people working more efficiently on the same problem with better technology, or money. And the beautiful part about artificial intelligence is you unlock two of those forms of leverage and unleash them in an exponential way beyond what we've seen being capable before.
I think that is probably why we're seeing so many of these tech leaders invest so much into AI because they see a real benefit, economic benefit coming to them. If you look at, say, the hyperscalers you talked about, Apple, or sorry, Amazon, Google, Meta, which is Facebook, and you look at the amount of capital expenditures or CapEx that they've ramped up and are investing into AI, it's mind-boggling, honestly. You look just 4 or 5 years ago, and each of them are investing, say, 20 to $25 billion a year into CapEx or infrastructure or research. And this year, it's projected that each of them are expected to spend over $100 billion a year in CapEx on these things. I mean, this is an astounding amount
Huge.
of output and investment into this space. And a couple of them have commented on that because, as you can imagine, a lot of people have been asking, is this really going to pay off? Larry Ellison, the co-founder of Oracle, said, I'm willing to go bankrupt rather than lose this race. Sundar, the CEO of Google, said the risk of underinvesting is dramatically greater than the risk of overinvesting for us here. And then I think a real classic quote from Mark Zuckerberg, which a lot of you guys have probably heard, the CEO of Facebook. He said, if we end up misspending a couple $100 billion, I think that is going to be very unfortunate. But essentially, it's a risk that's worth taking. It's higher on the other side of us not being aggressive enough. So let's dive into this a little bit more and try to understand what is the big prize here that they're trying to achieve. What does winning the AI race look like for some of these companies?
So you got a couple things. So the first, think about this in the context of like the internet as an example. So you got the turn of the millennia. What were all these companies ultimately competing for? There are typically monopolies that are found that ultimately can generate much larger profits, and there's usually one major winner. So think about that within the internet. That was Google when it comes to search, Amazon when it comes to things like online shopping, Meta when it comes to social media. And we could come up with probably another dozen companies that
Yeah.
ultimately achieved monopolistic status in their particular industry, and they were able to capture the lion's share of the financial rewards in those areas. We will see similar outcomes in AI as well. Now, it is hard to know what those areas are at this point. In a similar way, back in 1999 and 2000, I think you might have had a few visionaries who could have pointed to, say, search or other things
Yeah.
like that. But many of them, the question was still, what is the monopolistic area ultimately
We
going
know
to
it's
be?
going to be big, but we just don't know what it is yet. Yeah.
Exactly. So, like as an example, today the question is like, is the infrastructure, is the GPUs, is that and the data centers, is that a monopolistic area? Not sure. Could it be the application layer that goes on top of that? Maybe. Or could it be something that we don't even understand yet? It could be honestly any one of those things. But the one thing we do know is that once again, the amount of leverage that you unlock is huge here. So if you can get that leverage and then ultimately be able to center it on making a particular industry or problem solved, it has a lot of potential. So anyways, I think that's the big goal that we're ultimately looking at here is for the companies at least, they're trying to target and find what are these monopolistic areas that they'll be able to generate a lot of profits for a long period of time.
Yeah, and then I think ultimately too, beyond that, uh, you could arrive at something like a super intelligence, right? Where you're then able to uh, go and solve a lot of the problems that we otherwise wouldn't be able to solve with just the resources that we have today. So if you can imagine a company that is has achieved super intelligence before everybody else, or at the very least alongside others, they're able to go out and potentially very quickly solve a lot of big issues. I mean, I think a very obvious area where that would play out would be in the medical world, right? If you could go out and say cure cancer in a matter of weeks, I mean, that would be uh, amazing and obviously lead to a significant amount of economic benefit to that particular company. So when we think about super intelligence, I think that's obviously very far down the road. But I do think that it is something that a lot of these people are looking, or a lot of these companies are looking to achieve. Josh,
Another,
maybe you can fill
yeah,
us in a little bit on there on what super intelligence really would look like.
Yeah, so one other thing real quick before I get to that, which is, one of the other areas that would be a really good example of if you and so I guess that's an important thing first off, if we can achieve super intelligence.
Right.
That's just one thing. If you start to talk to these and listen to these CEOs of the hyperscalers and these other venture capitalists that are in the AI space, I have heard very few that will give definitive answers when it comes to when they think or if they think it's possible. In fact, I think we've heard some that have said that with this iteration of technology, they don't think it's possible. So,
Right.
so we are definitely talking in a very theoretical sense. But if so first off, what is superintelligence? I think that's the important thing. So it goes beyond AGI, and here's some of the major characteristics: vastly superior reasoning, creativity beyond human imagination, strategic planning at a level that we really can't follow, perfect recall, the ability to instantly learn, and then scientific insights that dwarf what human research has been able to do up to this point. Those are some of the characteristics that you would see with superintelligence. Now you can see why corporations would want to try to get to that point. Max gave a great example, and I think another really good example would be if you could ultimately have a artificial intelligence do the research and ultimately figure out how we can actually economically execute on fusion. That would be another huge win. If we could literally take, the cost of electricity from 17, 18 cents a kilowatt hour down to basically zero, that would be huge for mankind. And any company that ultimately could figure that out would, one, have a lot of pride in that, and two, be able to have a lot of profit from being able to do that as well. And so, anyways, I think those are some of the reasons why, obviously people are trying to push towards that.
So, in addition to this concept of individual companies winning the AI race, particularly in today's political environment with trade discussions and tariffs and all of this, a big topic that has come up is the concept of the United States winning the AI race versus, say, China winning the AI race. So, Laura, maybe you could delve into that a little bit for us and help us understand the difference between, say, companies winning the AI race versus actual countries kind of competing in this space.
Yeah, like you mentioned, we're not the only country in this race, and our biggest competitor, hands down, is China. I think that it's important to note that there's multiple fronts that we're running this race against them. The first is the actual technology itself, whether it's the hardware, the design, manufacturing, and innovation of these GPUs and the software that comes with it. On the other side, though, and we've mentioned this a little bit, but there is a significant race when it comes to the energy infrastructure. A lot of conversation when it comes to AI is around the amount of energy that it takes to run these LLMs, to run these data centers. Um, and we actually talked about this in a Beyond the Noise webinar 2 or 3 years ago. But China has made a significant investment in building out their energy infrastructure. Over the next 10 years, they expect to build, I think it's like 400 nuclear fission reactors
Yeah, that's right.
across the country. Yeah, so they're really focused on solving this future expectation of energy demand by creating a significant amount of energy production. And I think that that's really important. It's not just the who's going to win the race on the actual product for AI, but who can actually produce the energy necessary to quote unquote win this race. I think what's most likely going to happen is like what we've seen with the with phone technology and the competition there. We end up having kind of two tech stacks, if you will. You have Apple tech stack and all the products that are associated with that. And then you have the Android tech stack and all the products that are associated with that. And even though there's other companies out there, those two hands down dominate that space. They own the majority of the market share there. And so they both happen to be US based companies, but I think there's likely that we have an AI tech stack in the US, whether it's one or two companies, maybe a group of companies that kind of run that system, and then an AI tech stack out of China that with one or two companies, most likely probably one that runs that tech stack as well.
Yeah, I think Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, came out and had a pretty provocative article or interview, and where he basically said he does not think that the US is going to win the
Mm,
AI race.
yeah.
Now, to be fair, I think there's probably a pretty decent chance it was a provocative statement to try to push us to change. And I think it's more of a if things don't change, we will probably lose. And he really pointed to three things in that process. The first of which was the fact that even though the US finally made it legal for NVIDIA to sell an older version of their GPUs to China, China has now come around and said, you Chinese companies cannot purchase it.
Right.
And so that has effectively forced Chinese companies to rely on domestic competitors alone in those cases. So that was the first reason that he pointed to. The second thing he pointed to was the fact that as part of the big beautiful bill, there was a provision put in there by Ted Cruz that would have allowed federal regulation to preempt state regulation of AI. That ultimately got struck from the bill. And the negative impact of that ultimately is that means that we can have 50 different states with 50 different sets of regulations that AI has to comply with. One of the first ones that have come out has been in Colorado, and it is very problematic for artificial intelligence. In fact, it's the language is very broad, but basically any person who feels like they have been algorithmically discriminated against can sue these large language model companies. And unfortunately, that's a hole about the size of two trucks that can go through. And if that remains the case, it's going to make it very difficult for AI companies in the US to be competitive against international groups. And then, of course, the last piece was what Laura touched on, which is the energy side of things. We just don't have nearly enough power to deal with what we need to do with in the future with AI.
Yeah, let's delve into that a little bit more. I think it'd be helpful for us to explore that topic a little bit further because if there is going to be something that is going to impede or is already impeding AI, it's going to be the energy side of things. And I think that's a little bit twofold. One, it would be true or it's starting to impact things on the uh, kind of social side of things, right? I think you're seeing a lot of people start to experience some negative financial impacts from AI, and that's creating some social pushback on this topic. So, for example, if we look over the last 10 years, we've seen the average price of residential electricity increase by about 40%. And most of that has actually occurred in really the last 4 or 5 years. And we've gone from, 12 and a half cents per kilowatt hour to 17 and a half cents. And if this trajectory continues, you're going to have more and more people push back on this. And we've got to do something about that. I think one thing that you'll probably see is you're going to see, and we're starting to see some regulations change here, and some of the um, companies recognize this, but as they build new data centers, they're actually trying to build off-grid energy production as well in connection with that. So that may be something that helps, but they are limited because they're competing for the same uh, energy infrastructure that we need on the grid as well. And that kind of ties into something that I want us to dive in more to, which is energy demand and what that future looks like. So on the left-hand side, this takes a look at US data centers and their share of United States energy demand. And you can see just a couple of years ago in 2023, they represented about 4% of US energy demand. And we're just looking at data centers. And if you look at it in 2030, just 3 or 4 or 5 years in the future, they're expected to represent about 12% of US energy demand, and which is about 606 terawatt hours of electricity each year. And that's equivalent to the electricity consumption of Norway or Sweden just a couple of years ago. So we're talking about a significant increase there. But if you look on the right-hand side, this takes a look at not just data centers, but total electricity demand in the United States. And this looks out to 2050, which, a 25-year projection is somewhat suspect in my opinion. But, if you take a look at this, it's suggesting that we could see almost a doubling of the energy demand between now and 25 years from now. Uh, if you were to ask me, I think that's probably grossly underestimated of what the future energy demand is going to be. But just look, 5 years out in 2030, we're looking at about a 25% increase versus where we are now. And if you look at the future projections of energy production in the United States, we fall far short of what our expected demand is going to be. And again, I think that these uh, assumptions are somewhat underestimates going forward. So, do you guys feel like we are making some progress here? Are we going to be able to keep up with this energy demand, or is it really going to impede the progress of AI?
Sundar, in a recent phone call, made the
Sundar's the CEO of Google, right?
that's right. Yeah, CEO of Google. Um, he made the comment recently that we have GPUs right now that we can't turn on.
Hmm.
We don't have enough energy for them. So it's already impacting the AI race. And I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges for the US. As Laura mentioned, China has already taken a significant steps to increase their energy production. Their goal on a daily basis is to get from sub 3 terawatt hours of power that it produces to 10. So a dramatic increase in what they're currently doing. We talked about this in a past Beyond the Noise episode. But the US, on the other hand, is currently sitting at a little bit above 1, and their goal has been to get to 2. And so, with the increasing demand of just the AI data centers, this doesn't begin to touch all the other applications. Think about robots. Guess
Hmm.
what? Those things require electricity as well, and we haven't even begun to start to mass produce those. So, I think there's potentially a lot of other things that'll come out of AI that will
Electric
also.
vehicles is another example, right? I mean, if we
Yeah,
have
exactly.
fleets of
Electric
electric
vehicles
vehicles,
have barely begun to touch the grid
Yeah.
at this point, and we already are experiencing issues. And so the challenge is there's not a lot, at least, that we can do in, say, the next 2.5 to 3 years. Because the problem is nuclear used to only be able to be really rolled out in 10 years. Even with Trump's executive orders, that's getting condensed significantly, which is great. Don't get me wrong, but it's getting condensed to 3 years. But that's an executive order, which, depending on what happens with the next election, that could get rolled back and we're back to 10 years again. Um, so the next natural place to go would be natural gas, because natural gas normally takes 18 to 24 months to be able to roll out a new natural gas plant. But the problem right now is natural gas turbines are in such high demand that even if you put in an order today, you're probably looking at least 3, and I've heard in some cases 4.5 years before you'd actually get an active natural gas turbine that you could actually use to put into the system. And so, you could potentially do some renewables like solar or wind, but the problem is they're not good, stable state power. It's going to be, in waves, in which case you only can really capture it if you use batteries, but battery technology is also not where it really needs to be. So we're in a situation where it's hard to see situations in the next 2 to 3 years improving dramatically. We can start things today that 2.5 to 3 years from now can really start to improve things. And the only real viable things I've heard are two things. One, um, repurposing old infrastructure that's been decommissioned. So you saw Meta recommission the old nuclear facility. That was a good move. I've also heard strategies of basically trying to get more out of the existing grid. Try to make sure that we've got a lot of waste in the existing grid. Try to basically maximize that. But
Make
even
it more efficient.
yeah, make it more efficient. But even with that, you're probably, the most optimistic estimates I've seen have been maybe we get 10% more out of the grid, maybe 15. And so that's going to be a problem. I mean, this will be a significant hindrance to our competitive abilities unless we can find some other ways to get more out. Which there are. You could make the hardware more efficient. You could limit. There's this concept in AI called the context window. You can limit the amount of data that you're requiring the AI to process. That can make it less energy stringent for the models to operate. So there are some things that you can do, but we don't know what the innovation will allow in terms of making these things more energy efficient.
Josh, I'd also say, we've talked about this again in the previous webinar, but one of the things that the three of us are pretty strong proponents of is nuclear energy. And going to your back to your point, Max, as far as the social portion, there's a lot of people who are very much not in my backyards. They do not want new nuclear facilities in their communities. It's regardless of the innovations of safety and technology, it's just one of those issues that is highly contested in our current society. So a lot of times, if we are able to even greenlight the growth of that area, they're going to have to be put in places where there's not a lot of people. And back to your point, Josh, you have to try to get that energy created there to city centers, to data centers, and the grid is still inefficient. So there's a lot of conversation around this that I think is important.
Yeah, the difficult thing I think that we're going to face as a country is China's not facing those same restrictions, right? And I think that gets back to Jensen Wang's point, right? Which is we've got to take some action here, or we are not going to be competitive on a global landscape. So the future is bright if we can really figure some of these things out. And hopefully we can. I mean, I certainly believe in the tenacity of the American capitalistic system. And if anybody can figure it out, I know that we can. But we've got some headwinds that we certainly have to overcome as we move into the future. So, with that, we're going to open it up for questions. If you guys, as a reminder, have questions, we would love to hear them. You can send them to my email address there on the screen, Max at the Fox Alliance. We've had a couple come in already that kind of tie into a topic that we were wanting to touch on anyway. But the first one, and both of them really have to do with this concept of what are the downsides of AI, right? There are some fears and concerns that we certainly have. And let's address kind of the first one, which is what about the people that are losing their jobs because of AI, right? I mean, that's certainly a reality that we're experiencing right now. We're seeing people lose jobs because AI is making everybody else more efficient. Laura, do you want to start us out there and we can go around the horn talking about our thoughts on this front?
Sure, sure. I think this is obviously an incredibly valid question, especially as we start talking about, the push to get to artificial general intelligence. Start talking about computers that are very human-like. Obviously, this is a very big concern. I think there's 2 points that I'd want to make. One is that I do think that artificial general intelligence can create this opportunity to significantly increase the productivity of already working people. I like to think of this example of like a software developer. If a software developer can develop, let's say, two pieces of software, new software in a year, and using AI, that same developer can create 10 pieces of software in a year. Doesn't mean that we have less software developers. It means that we have more efficiency and more productivity. And more productivity is really important for our economy long term. Not only does it, increase our ability to increase our GDP, have really strong economic impacts, But it also can make things cheaper in the long run. Technology has led to innovation multiple times in the past, which has led to the decrease in cost for a lot of products today. Cars are a great example. When we saw the assembly line kind of get replaced by robotics and mechanics, a lot of those people lost their jobs, unfortunately. But what it led to was an innovation in car automation and car technology that allowed for vehicles to, one, become more innovative, more efficient, and cheaper in the long run. So I do think that this is obviously going to be a really important conversation. We don't want to have a situation where a lot of people are out of work and we're just relying on robots, but I think that's less likely than the case that we use AI to increase efficiency and productivity overall.
I would add a couple of other things to that. One, if you look at most innovations, the thing that most people in the moment overlook is the new industries that are created. So think about the invention of the automobile at the turn of the century. Who got hurt? The liveries, the groups that created saddles and bridles and feed for horses. All those industries got crushed. But what replaced them was automobile manufacturing, a much bigger need for oil and gas, auto repair shops. And what was common amongst all those things is most of those jobs paid better than what you saw that they ultimately ended up replacing. Now, I don't want to underestimate that transition is difficult, and there will be individuals that will lose their job. And I would say for those that do, the thing that is going to be really important is have a willingness to look at what are the areas that are starting to take off and be willing to be trained in those areas. You're seeing this with advanced manufacturing. You're seeing people that never did it before. They're now starting to work in some of these advanced manufacturing facilities that are more robotic in nature. Those are
And one
high
of the
paying
reasons
jobs.
is because AI is making it capable or possible for them to be trained very quickly in that.
Hmm.
So, not only is AI creating that job, but it's also creating the ability for people that otherwise couldn't do that job to be educated enough to do that and to educate them quickly.
The other thing I would just also, two other things I'd point out. One, we live in a world that has a lot of robots already. We have dishwashers, we have washing machines, we have dryers, we have refrigerators that make ice. All these things used to be done by people instead of the machines that they're now done. Um, as those advances have occurred, what it has resulted in is a higher standard of living for people universally across the board. But it does ultimately also result in people typically losing their jobs in the short term on that side of things. The last thing I will mention, there's this concept in economics called the Jevons paradox, which basically is the cheaper something becomes, the more people use it. So a good example, in 1950, cost for flying on a commercial airline to go somewhere was 1,000% more expensive than it is today. That cost has dropped 90% since then. What's happened? The amount of people that fly has increased by 1,000%. So if artificial intelligence can result in the cost of things coming down substantially, it will likely result in the amount of the usage of those things to be higher, which will also create more jobs for people to work with. So we are concerned in the short term that you will see job loss, but we do believe in the longer term that it will be a net benefit to the broader economy as a whole.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to talk about and kind of transition into on the tail end of that conversation as well. A couple of other the concerns that we might have. If each of us were to talk about our concerns with AI and what the fears we might have about the future of this technology, what would you guys say that those are? And then we can wrap up by talking about some of the things that we are most excited about. But let's talk about the fears or concerns we have going forward. Josh, let's start with you.
I have probably two bigger societal concerns, first and foremost. One, as ChatGPT and other large language models have come out, I have seen what I would consider an alarming, just um, blank check trust for what the models tell us today. And so that's one of my concerns is that I think we have a lot of people in society that are just accepting that whatever the models say is true. Where one, the models aren't always right. We still come across situations a decent chunk of the time where they're not true. But also, I think that back to our point, these models their bias is determined by who does the reinforcement training. and how and what the parameters are surrounding that. And so that's one of my concerns is a at least initial what I would call almost blind trust for what the models
Yeah, I mean,
say.
I can't tell you how many times I've entered something into ChatGPT and just been like, that can't be
That
right.
can't
And
be
then I
right.
ask
Not
it
right.
again and it says, oh, you're right. That was not right. So,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's improved a lot. And it's becoming difficult to decipher what is actually accurate from what isn't. And so, yeah,
Right.
I think maintaining that critical thinking posture is really important, and is going to become even more important going forward.
And that honestly bridges to the second point I was going to bring up, which is basically um, if we have more and more, I mean, one of the common themes that we see, I mean, think about like the greatest generation. I think most people refer to the World War II generation as the greatest generation. And I would argue one of the reasons they were is because they actually had to endure a lot of hardship. They had to do a
Mhm.
lot of things themselves. As modernization and innovation happens, there's a big part of me that's excited about that. But there's also a part of me that worries about what is the impact as more and more are done for humans and they have to do less and less for themselves. Specifically in this area of critical thinking. If young people only ever have to ask the large language model a question, I worry that some of the critical thinking that I think has made the human species so innovative and working hard and everything else that goes along with that potentially could be stunted. I
Yeah,
will throw
necessity is the mother of invention,
Yeah,
right? And that's
exactly.
kind of what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Laura?
Yeah, I think Josh hit the nail right on the head with my biggest concern, which is the lack of the ability to problem solve. I mean, I think our desire as humans to solve some of the world's biggest problems I mean, since the creation of humans, has led to our ability to innovate as much as we have today. And I really fear that if we lose the problem solving ability, um, and we lose that critical thinking period, that we start to see, for lack of a better word, a dumber society, where we as humans are dumbing ourselves down, and the relying significantly on technology and these computers to answer questions for us. I think one of the biggest questions that people ask is like, why do I need to take algebra in when I'm in, middle school? And I think that's really, really important because it teaches kids how to solve problems. And I hope that we continue to see that even if AI takes off.
Yeah, yeah, great point. I think another big concern that a lot of people have is, and this is probably due to Hollywood, honestly, in a lot of ways, but is this concern of uh, the AI becoming sentient in some way, right? Developing a consciousness and taking over the world and becoming a real threat to humanity. And I've seen a lot of movies myself. You think about iRobot, you think about Eagle Eye. There's lots of them out there, right? That
Terminator.
yeah, that really are concerning, right? And I get that. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit. And I'll kind of kick us off there. I mean, I, I personally believe that if that were to occur, which I think is very unlikely, but if it were to occur, I think it's way, way down the road. This is something that's very far in
You
our
have to
future.
hit artificial superintelligence.
You
You
have to
have
hit artificial superintelligence. Absolutely. And again, I think that's questionable whether we'll hit that point or not. But I think something that is encouraging to me in that respect is you already do hear a lot of the leaders in AI talking about ways to safeguard against that. I mean, we're in a position right now where AI is very far from sentient. It feels like it because of the way that it's interacting with us, but you have to tell it what to do. And it's not really at that capability yet where it can go off and do its own thing. And not to mention it's still very cyber related, right? It doesn't have a physical um, presence as of yet. Now we're making some progress towards that with self-driving cars and robots and those sorts of things. But you're hearing the Elon Musks of the world, the Sam Altmans of the world talking about the need to make sure that we have safeguards in place so that we maintain a very human-centric world as opposed to becoming an AI-centric world. So do you guys have anything else to add to that?
The only thing I would just say, Elon was on an interview recently. He actually cited the number one reason why he wanted the pay package that he got was specifically so he could still maintain about 25% of the vote with Tesla. And the reason he gave was because I don't want these amazing robots that I build to have for someone else to be able to control how they're done, and ultimately what safety measure, controls are ultimately put in place. I want to make sure that the safety is where it needs to be. So I think with some of the best engineers that we have out there, this is an area that they have concern about, and they're really trying to think creatively. And once again, remember, with all these AIs, you give them context windows, you give them limitations to what they can and can't do. And so, at least at this stage, there are substantial uh, features in place that prevent things like that from happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, I think Elon Musk gets a lot of flack for various reasons, but I do have a lot of confidence in his commitment to ensuring that this type of thing doesn't occur. And so I think that's a real positive thing. Uh, Maybe we just go around the horn real quickly and each of us mention one of the things that we're most excited about with AI. And we'll make this a lightning round because we're pushing on our time here. Josh, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, so probably there's so many different ones, but probably one of the areas that excites me the most is the area of robotics, and specifically being able to um, involve robotics in taking some of the jobs that humans have to do that are very dangerous. I think about things like in mining or explosives, or even fi the work with the fire department that a lot of people have to put their lives on the line for. That I think robotics could make a lot safer and reduce human death rates in those particular
Yeah,
industries.
I think
So
that's a very likely outcome.
that's one that I think is very achievable, and I think could have a very positive impact.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What about you,
I,
Laura?
I would say for me, it's probably the innovation in healthcare and pharmaceuticals, drug discovery research. You know, obviously with my background in chemistry and pharma, um, I think that that's definitely the area that I'm most interested in. You know, hopefully using something like AGI to um, increase the efficiency of the great work that a lot of these PhDs are already doing, and trying to find cures for some of our most debilitating diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's, ALS. I think that would be that's what I'm most interested and excited about.
Yeah, here. The one that I'll mention, which we're actually already starting to see, and I think is very likely to continue to play out, is autonomous vehicles. I mean, I think autonomous vehicles and self-driving is something that can do a lot of things for us. One, I think it can really improve safety on the roads. If we can have vehicles that don't get drunk, that don't fall asleep, I mean, we're in a position where our roads end up being a much safer place. It also has the potential to improve productivity a lot. So one, you could be doing things in the car while the car is driving itself as opposed to you driving. But then also, if you can have far less vehicles on the road because you can have one vehicle that is able to drive around four different people because they're traveling at different times, that has the potential to really reduce traffic and improve the speed and lifestyle of everybody. So I think that's something that is already playing out and is likely to continue to play out. But a lot of exciting opportunities on the future with in the future with AI. Some headwinds for sure that we have to overcome, and some concerns. But I think generally speaking, our perspective when it comes to technology, and I think generally speaking with this technology as well, is that it is likely going to improve the way of life and the lifestyle of most everybody across the board. And that's something that we are excited about and looking forward to what the future holds. So, once again, thank you guys for joining us today on our Beyond the Noise webcast. We look forward to having you guys join us again next time. Have a great day.